So, everybody's very welcome. We have some members of last year's class here. You're very, very welcome. Yeah? And we decided that we'd ask Elizabeth, who topped the class last year, to talk to you about her research, which is really all about translating some of the generalities of the UN Convention into something that makes sense in really an African context and resource-poor context. Mind you, I think we're actually all developing countries when it comes to disability. We're absolutely delighted to have Elizabeth's mother, Jane, with us. Thank you for travelling. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. You must be very proud of your daughter. And so, over to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. I think I just start off with a round of introduction so that I'm clear, okay. So I have an idea of what background, you come from, and that kind of thing. So, okay, yeah. So shall we start? Maybe. Okay, let's start here to my right. Oh.
His name is
Sindile from Zimbabwe. Okay. He's a teacher of Black people in Zimbabwe. So he advocates for Black people. Yeah, so I advocate for Black people. Yep. Okay, fine. So he says I know him. So that's Frank Sindile.
No.
Is it? That's Frank. Yeah, Musaka. Yeah, Musukwa. That's Frank Musukwa. Okay.
I'm Alberto. I'm a lawyer from Peru, and I used to work in the government and also with DPL.
Okay.
Hi, well, you know me too. But for everyone else, my name is Jean, and I did the course here last year. I'm a parent of a child with disability and working disability groups on the ground here, local level.
I'm Pooja. I'm from Nepal. I'm Innocentia. I'm from Zimbabwe.
I'm Jose Luis. I'm from Spain.
I'm Kiran. I'm from Nepal, and I used to work in non-government sector in disability back home.
Good morning, I'm Thomas from Germany, and I do my PhD about inclusive education and work as a research assistant at university.
I'm Gabriel from Mozambique, a person with disability, but also activist.
I'm Mary Keys, and I work here at the university and a tutor on the LLM and International Disability Law.
And I'm Siobhan Quillivan, and I'm lecturing at university, and I'm the director of the LLM.
Okay. I'm Jean, the proud mother. Okay, yeah, so on that note, I shall begin. Okay, so so today I'm going to talk about the findings of my dissertation. I wrote about Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I'm going to be mentioning Article 19 a lot. So it might help to, to sort of have a quick read through, so that, I don't know how familiar you are with the article, so maybe I could ask you to just quickly sort of read through what Article 19 is, so that we
Allowed for everybody?
Yes,
okay.
yes,
Yes.
make that clear.
So, states
Auf Deutsch.
States parties to this convention recognize the equal right of all persons with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others, and shall take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate full enjoyment by persons with disabilities of this right and their full inclusion and participation in the community, including by ensuring that persons with disabilities have the opportunity to choose their place of residence and where and with whom they live on an equal basis with others, and are not obliged to live in a particular living arrangement. B. Persons with disabilities have access to a range of in-home, residential and other community support services, including personal assistance necessary to support living and inclusion in the community, and to prevent isolation or segregation from the community. C. Community services and facilities for the general population are available on an equal basis to persons with disabilities and are responsive to their needs.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's the article we're going to be talking about. Okay, so we'll examine that article from the perspective of a developing country, Kenya. And I could start by just briefly telling you why I decided to research on Article 19. Prior to joining the LLM course, I worked as a Human Rights Officer on Disability at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and we were beginning to think about monitoring the convention under Article 33(2). So sort of what would monitoring the CRPD look like? So we were developing a monitoring plan, and with some articles it was easier to think about, conceptualize what the monitoring would look like. For instance, accessibility, we could, envisage going to state offices, sort of checking out, do they have ramps, how wide are their doorways, do they provide information in alternative formats or not. But when we got to Article 19, then we thought, okay, we don't have institutions here. What are we going to monitor? And it was really extremely confusing to think about what we'd look for. So when I came here, I thought, okay, that would be an interesting article to ask questions about, and so hence the initial interest in it. So the research questions I was asking were generally, so okay, what does Article 19 entail generally? How far along implementing it is Kenya? And I was lucky that I was doing this when our state report, so the state report required under Article 35 was before, Kenya's state report was before the CRPD committee. So it was easy to sort of look at what the state is saying on the different articles and sort of compare and gauge, okay, does the state get what Article 19 is about, and how far along are we? Because that's where the state says all the good things that it's doing on the different articles. And then the core of it really was, what are the core components of a policy that promotes Article 19 in Kenya? Okay, so when I got started, I thought I'd arrive at an abstract core that I could pinpoint and say, this is it, But as I proceeded, it became clear that to answer what Article 19 looks like in practice, first was to look into the best way I could do it was to look into what a policy would have to contain for it to promote Article 19 in our context. And we'll get into more into that when I go into the actual, now practical things. And how I went about the research, I went back to Kenya and I spoke to a lot of different people. I spoke with the Commission on Human Rights, which is now a constitutional body. I spoke with a few statutory bodies like the Kenya Society for the Blind. I spoke with a couple of NGOs, the Association for the Intellectually. Oh, by the way, feel free to stop me at any time if I'm going too fast or if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, and so there were some DPOs I spoke with as well. I also had a group interview with 6 people with intellectual disabilities. And I also spoke to parents, one of a deaf-blind young man and another with a child with an intellectual disability, and I also spoke with a professional. So it was sort of getting a professional with visual disabilities. So it was sort of getting views from different people about what Article 19 means in our African context. Okay, so some key definitions. So while it's generally about inclusion and participation of all people with disabilities, I concentrated on persons with high support needs, and I used the definition in Thomas Hammarberg's, the former High Commissioner on Human Rights, who defines persons with high support needs in the issue paper of this year as, to include people with intellectual disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, people with a dual diagnosis of intellectual and psychosocial, people with multiple disabilities, and people with physical or sensory disabilities but with significant ongoing medical, requiring ongoing medical attention. So that because while yes, all people with disabilities face discrimination, some face it, some are more marginalized than others, and in our context, even if you look at the state report, it reports very generally on Article 19, but doesn't say anything on people with intellectual disabilities, doesn't say anything on people with psychosocial disabilities, so is like even more invisible than just generally people with disabilities, as a blanket, statement. And then also another definition, I suppose, would be, I'll talk about institutionalization a lot, by which I mean, I like the European Coalition of Independent Living's definition of it, where they basically talk about an institution being a place in which people who've been labeled as having a disability are segregated and compelled to live together, and it's any place in which people don't have control over their day-to-day lives, and it's not defined merely by its size. So that's sort of what I mean when I talk about institutionalization. Okay, so having done that, so the main things we'll talk about is the Kenyan context, and I'll hopefully keep it brief, then a bit about the universality of independent living, and hopefully spend the bulk of time talking about what the recommendations were on making it practical in Kenya. Okay, I'm very good at this. Okay, yeah, so the Kenyan context. So we have a population of about 40 million people, and the prevalence of disability in the state reports it at 4.6%. Generally, the estimates tend to be much higher globally, but I think the last one was 15% or so, the World Health Organization one. But of course, the state is very keen on keeping the number down, because immediately it thinks disability, thinks resources, and therefore, and a lot, in fact, even the tools that they use to capture data on disability are very physical, disability oriented. And this is actually so even with regard to, under our Act, people with disabilities are supposed to be registered with a national council. But to be registered, you have to go through a board, and the board completely doesn't get it as far as psychosocial disabilities are concerned. So I've had people say to me, well, I was told everyone gets depressed every now and then. So what do you mean you want to be registered as a person with disabilities because you have depression? So that distinction still hasn't come through. Further with regard to the situation of people with disabilities in Kenya, we are still very much in the charity and medical model, and this is complicated by traditional beliefs on disability. I know some might identify with this more. I don't know whether because we have beliefs about curses and sort of witchcraft, and so those were more prevalent in the past, but it's still there. But even more so now with Christianity, then it's changed a bit. It's become, if you had faith, you'd be healed. So you'd think, it will get better, but not so much so. So they still, that is still very much the predominant view of disability in my country. And so, also a lot of these people with disabilities, so who will be about over 5 million people that we are talking about, given if you use 15% as the estimate, live with their families but without support, because the state basically has not for a long time seen itself as having a role in in provision, in actual provision of services, support services for people with disabilities. And so when you look at the state report, there's a lot of focus on people with physical disabilities and on segregated programs, and it talks a lot, actually when the state reports on Article 19, it pretty much reports on habilitation and rehabilitation. That's pretty much what it talks about, which you can see how it leaves everybody else out. And we look into the barriers a bit more later. The economic situation, Kenya is a non-welfare state. We've been rated by the UNDP as being of median human development, with over 50% living below the poverty line. That's just some background information. Okay, and so another thing I had to look into a lot is community. What does the word community mean? Because it's a word that can mean different things in different contexts. And so I asked the interviewees about this. What does community mean to you? And in our Kenyan context, what does it mean to be a person who's included in the community? And the answers were really interesting. Somebody said, well, here we are very religious, so going to church and participating in church-related activities, that's really key to being a member of the community. There were other answers, such as being involved in the rites of passage that people go through. So for instance, for us, male circumcision is a big one. So then a question, are people with disabilities included in those rites of passages or not? And usually anecdotal evidence just from talking to people shows, well, it might happen, but there's not that big a celebration as normally happens with, for everybody else. So there's that being left out in the things that are very core to community, but that you wouldn't actually sort of think about or find in a book. So the whole question of having a communal way of life, I asked about that, and the views were very mixed. This was one of the sort of where data was very sort of contradictory, because some people said, yes, we still maintain very much a communal way of life, particularly in the rural areas, but in the urban areas, not so much. It's really, really breaking down, and this, of course, has significant impact on families' ability to take care. This being removed from the social sort of setting has significant impact on how families are able to take care of their member with high support needs. So then, okay, also our legal context, we passed a new constitution in 2010. By dint of that constitution, everything we've ratified becomes automatically part of the law of Kenya. So that's how the CRPD then becomes part of our law. Article 27 is on equality. We have very sort of strong equality provisions in the Constitution. Article 43 is on social economic rights. Also very strong access to housing and food and water. Very, beautiful when you read it on paper. On the ground, often is a different thing altogether, as we'll see. And then we have a Persons with Disabilities Act, but it doesn't deal with the issue of living independently and being included in the community at all. So that's our context. So then one of the things that arose in the commission was that people would say, but how relevant is this Article 19 in our setting anyway? People are physically located in the community. How, is it relevant? So the whole issue of cultural relativism came up. And so when I did interviews, I spoke with an Ethiopian with a disability who actually lives in Galway. And I asked him about this because he'd started an independent living center in Ethiopia, and it hadn't gone well at all. Actually, it failed. And I asked him a bit about why and how that process was like for him. And he said, first of all, the first problem he encountered is the use of the word independent. Because people said, do you want us to live alone? And they also said independence is a Western concept. We are not independent here, we are interdependent of each other. So clearly there was a misconception of what independent living and inclusion in the community means. And this whole cultural conflicts will come up even more when we talk about mental health, but for now it's just enough to say in Ethiopia just the use of the word independent meant that even people with disabilities didn't support the venture, and it pretty much failed. So, but then the thing is, that's the wrong way to look, you know, that's a limited way of looking at independent living. It's pretty much from, you know, from what you read, it's pretty much about people having, you know, being able to be self-determining individuals, having choice equal to others, having equal access to the services that everybody else in the community enjoys. So when you think about it like that, then it's not an abstract thing. It's a practical thing all of us want. We want to be able to have choices same as other people. We want to be able to control, to have control of our lives, to make our own decisions, and to have support to make those decisions when we need the support, and to be able to direct that support so that it's not supply driven. It's, you know, it meets our needs. It's not, and so it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, I don't think it, you know, it's a Western concept, or it has anything to do with, okay, when you achieve this much money, then you can have independent living. And until then, you know, it's not part of what you're going to do. No. Okay, so in the research as well, I think, okay, so I'm not going into the whole Berkeley history of independent living movement, you know, so, you know, sort of because of the time and everything, and that sort of information, you know, that's available online. Okay, so Africa's interpretation of the rights to independent living during the negotiations. It's interesting when you look into the archives and see what the different countries had to say on the article. Principally, Europe and America was very much about institutions and how do we dismantle them, or, you know, how do we move forward from there, while African countries very much emphasized support to families extremely, and were very keen on making a distinction between the independent living movement and the living and being included in the community just as a concept. So they agree, yes, we want inclusion, but we don't necessarily want it modeled on the independent living movement as is known in the developed world. Okay, so I've already said this, that emphasis in Kenya has been on habilitation and rehabilitation. And I've already said this about the, you know, the difficulty of, you know, oh yeah. Welcome, Martin.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Come on in, join us.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. So just talking about Article 19 and how it applies in the context of a resource-scarce setting, being Kenya. So that's what I've been talking about. So okay, on to the recommendations now. The key recommendation was that we should, as a country, develop a community living policy to promote choice, to promote provision of individualized support services, just to promote those things that Article 19 is about, to promote equal access to mainstream services. Because then, without a policy, everything, like, because now there are initiatives around inclusion, but all of them are very on a goodwill basis, and all of them are very, it's the current government that seems a bit interested in these issues. So you're not sure what happens if another government comes in with different priorities. So it will be so critical to just have an overarching sort of policy that says this is, you know, this is what, you know, this is what we want, this is how we want to achieve inclusion in our context. And of course, as we go through this, it's important to sort of have at the back of our minds that, you know, so these are state obligations, and obviously a lot of them have to do with being progressively realized. A lot of the things that we're going to be talking about have to do with, you know, being realized within time, you know, doing better next year than, you know, than you're doing this year on the different things. Okay, so the first one is choice. So the question was, what would a policy have to comprise of in Kenya for it to promote choice? So I started off with the meaning of choice. Of course, the convention is about choice being on an equal basis with others. So I like something Gerald has written saying, I think it's from the structural funds, where it says, it's not about an ideal, saying that people with disabilities have this choice of where to live that other people don't have. It's about, so obviously we all have things that limit our ability to move into rich neighborhoods or, but it's about people with disabilities having choices on an equal basis with other people. And as we move on, you'll see how on really many levels in our context, people with disabilities do not have choice on an equal basis with other people. And it's a question, is this Article 19 a means to an end or an end in itself? That's another thing that's worth thinking about. And I think I agree that it's, the end is always of a person's, it should be of a person's own choosing. There's a general end in mind, that inclusion and participation in society, but it should be, the end for it should be of a person's own choosing, and then the means is the steps we need to take, to make this inclusion possible. So then it's geared towards, it's not abstract, it's geared towards people with disabilities flourishing in the communities, not just being physically located there, but actually having lives within the community. And okay, so that's now, the ideal, that's what we want. But I'll give an illustration that shows how, choice is limited, and I've spoken with Mary about this on occasion. I'm working with an organization called Users and Survivors of Psychiatry in Kenya, a bit doing some work around mental health. And one of the things that came out is, someone with a mental health condition says, sometimes I have to decide, will I take my medicine or will I take food? I can't have both. I cannot afford both. So they say we actually go without food so that we can afford medication. So that's the setting in which we are discussing these things. So choice in this sense can be extremely limited, considering that choice has to do with having alternatives, and so you have to ask sometimes what alternatives are there in that context. And so so that's that just illustrates what choice is about, but that's not to say that nothing can be done. So this is what I thought a policy for it to promote choice would have to do. It would have to focus on persons with high support needs. Specifically, it would have to raise their awareness on their rights. And I have an example from the Kenya Association of the Intellectually Handicapped. I spoke with the lady who leads it and who heads it. And she said to me, we've begun to teach people with intellectual disabilities basic rights, like your right to privacy, and and she said it's made such a tremendous difference that before, in their families, they were meant to be seen, not particularly heard, and they'd be, for instance, made to change clothes in front of their younger siblings, sort of, in a disregarded way. But since they've been taught that you are, you're a person, you have rights, you should be able to have the right to just the small things, to privacy, to change your clothes in the privacy of, a different place and not have your whole siblings there. She said it's made such a difference. Self-advocates with intellectual disabilities have gone home and have told their parents, no, this will not happen. Again, I want to be able to have my own space. And so it's in the little things, and it's organizations like that that are making a huge difference. And suddenly this whole idea, Article 8 on awareness raising, doesn't seem so empty. You hear people tell you the difference, it makes in their lives when they are equipped with the knowledge to be able to, to live their lives, to have more control over their lives. Of course, the policy should focus on families as well, raising awareness once again, and also financial support. Okay, so at the same time as I was writing the dissertation, Inclusion International was doing a global study on inclusion, on Article 19, on the same article as I was writing on. And one of the things that their finding came out with was that families that have someone, because they specifically with intellectual disabilities, are disproportionately poor. and it's not a finding with regard to Africa, it's across the globe. And so therefore financial support to families, and we look at part of what Kenya is doing around this, is a key thing. And then obviously having flexible working hours for carers is a big one, because then that's the only way in which they can maintain employment and still, you know, be able to do the caring work. And it's been said, you know, that a just society would reward caring work, would see it as work, and would, you know, will compensate for it. And so another thing about families also is sort of encouraging family support groups. And this came out from an interview with someone in the Canadian Association for Independent Living, and he said to me, people underestimate the value of philosophies and attitudes, and that such a big change is made when families come together and begin to exchange ideas. When families come, such a mutual support is gathered when families come together and begin to think, how can we include, what do we do, you know, with regard to inclusion, to making sure that our members with disabilities are part of the community and actually have a thriving life within the community. And he said that's like such a strong beginning point, because ultimately families stay when, you know, when nobody else is there. So that's key. So another thing with regard to choice, so the country has started to pilot, Kenya has started to pilot cash transfer to people with high support needs and their families, about 70 households per constituency, and they're giving them about 3,000 Kenya shillings, which is like 30 euro per month, but before there was nothing. So now you can see the state is beginning to think about, to see its role as, to see its role as actually making provision, directly to people, to their citizens. Before then, there wasn't anything, and but it isn't in law yet, so it's very program-based and can change anytime. When I spoke with people from the ministry who are running this project, they said it's had such a tremendous impact in making disability visible, that before people hid their children with disabilities and sort of locked them up and didn't want them to come out. But now that the state has said, we will support, we will give some little support to you, suddenly families are bringing out their people and saying, okay, look, me too. And even if the state may not be able to, provide for, all of them, they search power in just being out there, just being, being out there, being seen, being visible. Exactly. Yeah, and then, okay, so, but the program obviously has a lot of challenges. One of the things they told me was, of course, limited funds. Of course, the 30 euro per month is barely enough. And also, I need to make a clarification that it's not going, the money isn't going directly to the person with a disability, it's per household. It's, it's 30 euro per household. And, they said to me, look, so we give it to the family, but we are not sure that it goes to the person with a disability. And these are poor families, so often it will go to food for everybody. And so, you're here writing this paper and you're thinking, but, what do families do? If this is the amount of money they have and they have to make a choice, and so those are some of the things that complicate the whole thing. But when I spoke with someone who said, look, this money should be given conditional upon it being used for the person with a disability. So for instance, if they need for the person to attend school, it should be given conditional to class attendance reports, and it should be given conditional to showing exactly how the money is being used. On the one hand, it sounds good. On the other hand, I don't know how workable, it is on the ground when people are making these choices. But, there were those proposals, and I put them out there and sort of thinking about it. Of course, another challenge was they said they don't know how to gauge these things. So disability, they're just civil servants. They said, I'm a civil servant, I go there to the village, I say, where are all those people with disabilities? I look and see. So he says he looks and he thinks, this one looks like they should qualify, this one doesn't. So there's no systematic way yet as to how this money is being allocated, and that's a problem as well. Okay, so then of course the policy must address mental health care, because in Kenya it's in the realm of mental health care that we have institutionalization. We do not have community-based services for people with mental health conditions whatsoever. The country has about 75 psychiatrists. We were complaining about that until somebody said Mozambique, is it, has five, you know, and then suddenly you say, you think,
oh, sorry, Zambia.
You know, suddenly you think, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, is it
so,
five?
but even medical doctors in Mozambique, for a population of 23 million, we have less than 800 doctors, medical practitioner, GPs. So you can see the resources there if you talk about access to health.
Yeah.
So one can be born and die 40 years without seeing a medical doctor.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Yeah. And it's pretty much the reality in Kenya. I mean, it's, you know, so that's what we're talking about. So, you know, so, yeah, so definitely the policy must, you know, say, look, let's develop community-based services, because if you think about it, that may require an initial investment, but that's sustainable long-term, than having this one mental health institution where you put everybody. And then we had this report from CNN showing really grim, you know, images of Kenya's main mental health institution where abuses happen, and, you know, so, and that's the problem with institutions across the globe. You know, they're behind closed doors. Nobody knows what goes on in there, you know. So, and of course, ultimately, early intervention and, you know, and support. The whole mental health thing has a lot, you know, I think is conflicted the world over, because, so if you're talking about, back to what Article 19 is about, having choice and control over your life, in the realm of mental health care, a lot of it has to do with forced treatment. You know, you're not having choice or control over what happens, this whole bodily integrity things, just, you know, not being there. But when I spoke with someone who's a user of psychiatry, he said to me, you have to be very careful about your messaging around forced treatment in Africa. And he said, look, here people are living with their families. He said to me, for me, when I was refusing to take medication, what my mom did is she said, you know, I've tried enough. So now what you're going to do, you're going to leave my home. And the state doesn't step in to take care of you when you leave, when you're thrown out by your family. So he said, after about 3 months in the streets, very tough life, I came back and I said, okay, now mom, let's do this. Let's do this. So those are some of the, you know, the difficulties there. So when you're talking about people not actually having access to the very basic of treatment, how then are you also, you know, how do you need to couch your message around bodily integrity and the right to personal autonomy? And this also came up again as a cultural thing. So now families say, okay, look, you're saying the person has the right to independence and autonomy and should be able to refuse treatment. Then they ask you, but what about us? You know, it's not just an individual, we are a collective whole, and we take collective responsibility for each other in our culture. And they said to you, for us, for him to be walking out there, we can't allow it. You know, sorry, it's not just about him, it's about all of us as a family. And so, you know, there are no easy answers. You know, so you know the rights, but you don't know exactly what to say when a practical situation presents itself there. Okay, so, but definitely there's some good work going on around mental health care in Kenya. That organization, Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, are beginning support groups. I've attended one, and it's a really good sort of place where people with mental health conditions sit down together and just talk about life. And there's such peer support, and they're trying to replicate it across the country. But of course, they have very limited funding, and they're doing a lot of this on volunteer basis. But it's a group of really passionate people, and they're beginning to make a difference just from the grassroots up. And I think it's a positive thing. Of course, the policy must also, for a policy to promote Article 19, it must address, you know, it must recognize disabled people's organizations, and so there's the need to build the capacity of DPOs, because DPOs are the ones that are really working on the grassroots pretty much as far as people with high support needs are concerned. The government is not doing much, yet a lot of DPOs also are not very well equipped in terms of being human rights based, and in terms of being, a lot of them are still very charity model in Kenya, so there's a need to equip them, and there's, you know, need to develop self-advocacy, as I've given the example of the users and survivors of psychiatry. Okay, so that's Article 19.1. Of course, these issues are cross-cutting, but okay, so measures with regard to support. How can a policy ensure support in our Kenyan context? Why support is important, I'll read you something that one of the people I interviewed said. He was the father of a 25-year-old deaf-blind young man. He said to me, "You hear of expressions such as locked up, my Brian is in the house," whatever you want to call it. If you call that locking up, so be it, but he's in the house. Where else do you want me to take him? He can't work in an office. So for me, it's not really locking up, but that's the best that I can do in the absence of other interventions. So that's sort of where families are at when they don't have support. They, you know, it says, well, you call it locking up if you want, but where do you want me to take him, you know? So that's, you know, and community-based rehabilitation is the means that inclusion has taken in developing countries. So there's this whole idea of community-based rehabilitation being the means, you know, the means to provide support. As to how well it's working on the ground, not great. First, they're very medical model based, so it's about let's fix the person. It's also very focused again on people with physical disabilities to the exclusion of people with more, you know, with other disabilities. So, and it's also not in the control of people with disabilities themselves. That was raised as a huge problem. It's about other people deciding what would be best for these people. So that's a problem. With regard to support as well, there's ideas around developing a community living center in Nairobi as the first pilot project. I should be run, controlled and organized by persons with disabilities. I'm sure Martin, this is really where Martin is an expert and will, you know, probably be speaking to us a bit about later, but that's sort of the vision. And already Kenya is working with Japan International, you know, the JICA, the international organization on aid, around piloting a project of community living center in Nairobi. It's actually progressing, where they'll envisage it as having different people like interpreters and all that to, you know, to support people with disabilities. Okay, so somebody said, how about if we professionalize family care? He said, look, if this kinship thing that we say we have here in Africa was working so well, people wouldn't be locked up as they are. So how about we just pay people's sisters and brothers to look after them, to provide support? And again, it's, you know, I said that to someone and they laughed. They said, come on, do you really think this is going to happen? But, you know, it's a proposal, it's out there, and, you know, it's one of the things that were proposed. So, okay, so finally, inclusion, which is now C, which requires basically making the social space, making everything inclusive, making everything mainstreaming pretty much. The meaning being that we all, you know, having a sense of belonging is important to all of us, but it calls upon a complete change in the systems as they exist. One of the people I spoke with said, this is actually the most important piece, yet it's the hardest piece to put in practice. Because if obviously it's about community services such as education and employment being accessible at one level, but at another level it's also cultural, political, it's also really big about how our communities are organized and how inclusive are they, just at a really large scale. Already in Kenya there is disability mainstreaming, but again this is happening ad hoc. There is no policy around it. It's just the government said, oh, let's have disability mainstreaming committees in all the departments. So someone I spoke to said, we really don't know what we're supposed to be doing, but we've been designated disability mainstreaming committees. Again, it shows there's goodwill, but there's goodwill without, you know, the backing of proper information and proper knowledge, but it's a place to start as it is. So, you know, disability mainstreaming in all those spheres, of course, a question arises, if you're talking about services, what do you mean in a context where services are extremely limited for everybody? So if you're talking about a slum, for instance, an informal settlement as they're called in some other places, services there with regard to access to housing, access to water, access to sanitary conditions for everybody are pretty bad. So, you know, what are you saying when you're now talking about people with disabilities? So, you know, on the one hand, we can clearly see how all communities can be inclusive. On the other hand, you can also see how in practice what the difficulties are when you're talking, you know, when you're talking about where people have extremely limited possibilities across the board. I suppose a partial answer lies in the concept of progressive realization of rights, which we are trying to, which actually there's a lot of NGOs now just working about. Like we have NGOs on housing, just trying to push on housing. So that means the question then DPOs need to be asking is, when we are upgrading slums, because that's a big project that we are having now, are people with disabilities included as among the people moving to the upgraded houses? You know, so those are some of the things that DPOs need to engage in, and you know, are beginning to think about. But yeah, so it's very much there that the aspect of progressive realization of rights comes in. That as the country achieves these socio-economic rights for everybody, people with disabilities must also be included. So there's an example is inclusive education. Okay, so we have free education in Kenya at primary level. Is it at secondary level as well? I think, yeah, at secondary level, as long as it's not boarding school or something like that. Anyway, so we have free education, but if you have a disability, even at primary level, it will be provided in separate settings. So what that means, and I spoke with people who said, I went to school 800 kilometers away from home, because that's where the nearest school was. So he says, when you come back after you're done with school, you can't speak the local language, or we can barely speak the local language. So if inclusion in community life in our context also means belonging to a tribe, you know, belonging to a certain ethnic community, speaking that language. But if you're removed at the age of 5 and taken to a whole different setting, what becomes of you in terms of trying to reintegrate back to the community which you're supposed to come from? It's extremely difficult. Yet, on the other hand, the professional I spoke with said to me, look, yes, I had difficulties living 800 kilometers away from home, but I accessed a pretty good education. He has a visual disability. And he says the thing is, this new inclusive education that the government is talking about is not really happening. He says blind children now are not accessing the level of education that I accessed. So he says, if you tell me to choose between living in my community and accessing a good education away from it, I will choose accessing a good education away from the community. So the question then is, how do we make sure that the local school not only speaks in the rhetoric of inclusive education, but actually truly includes in terms of quality? You know, so on the, you know, because the government has accepted the rhetoric of inclusive education. Yeah, all the policies say inclusive education, but if you go to the ground, there is no support for children with disabilities. Somebody said to me they took a child who with autism was doing pretty well. They thought, oh, this would make the case for inclusion. But when they joined the mainstream class, which has sometimes 80 students to one teacher, I mean, the teacher is overwhelmed as it is. They are not going to go out of their way at all. So then, what do you mean inclusion? So those are some of the conflicts. But at the very least, if you say inclusive education, okay, so the point was, actually I got a bit derailed. The point was that in education for children with disabilities, it's not free. They have to pay because they access it in boarding schools. They have to pay. So every other child can access education free of charge. But if you have a disability, the only way to do it is you have to pay school fees, because you have to go to that boarding school miles away from home. So at the very least, at that level, that's discrimination, you know, right there, you know. So it's things like that. And then finally, there are some cross-cutting issues. The policy must address awareness raising, because I mean it's core to actualizing Article 19. But then there's a question, who will do it? Because when I spoke with people, they say, I find the government really ignorant on disability. Yet the obligation is on the state to raise awareness. So, okay, who, you know, where is the repository of knowledge on matters of disability in our country? And I think this is a good point for international cooperation as under Article 32. I think that's really core there, feeding into government, sort of educating civil servants around these things. People, when I spoke with the self-advocates, they said when we went to try and get identity cards, we were told that we could not be filled for the forms. So the civil servants are like, you can't get an identity card if you can't fill the form yourself. Completely no understanding of what support means. So they don't vote because they don't get, you know, because they can't access an identity card, which is a document that you have to have if you're good. So it's very compounded, and yet the state is equipped, you know, it's supposed to raise awareness, but yeah, so the role for international cooperation comes in there. And of course, accessibility is a cross-cutting issue across the board of buildings, of public transport, of information, and of the social space. For the first time next year, with the new constitution, we are going to have two places in Senate for senators with disabilities. So that's a positive move that, you know, that's come out of the new constitution. So there were a lot of issues requiring further research. How to ensure that all policies are inclusive, that's difficult, because one of the things is you have policies that don't look on the face of them like they have anything to do with disability, but actually really do. For instance, you have policies that encourage development in urban areas, which means people move to urban areas, which means the extended family, the support that exists in, at least to some extent, in the rural areas is broken down. But how do you even think that far when you're just thinking about a pretty economic, you know, a pretty economic policy there on the ground, yet the impact is so big on people with high support needs. So those are some of the issues. So the dilemmas that I raised under the cash transfer program in the context of poverty, how to ensure that DPOs retain their independence, for instance, if they are funded by the state, because they are struggling financially, and the state has this obligation to do this. It will do it through DPOs, but how do they get funded by the state and yet retain their independence? How to use international cooperation to further inclusion, how to bridge the gap in a resource-scarce setting where families are absent. For instance, sometimes families just are not here. You know, a lot of the proposals I've given are around families allowing these things to happen. Families joining together with people with disabilities. But what about when they leave? For instance, in a lot of cases with mental health conditions, families just take you to the institutions and just feel and they leave. So what steps, what bridges that gap in our context? So what alternatives in mental health care exist in our setting, and how do we protect against abuse within the community without resorting to paternalistic, you know, because in an institution we see how the abuse happens, not we see, but you know, you can envisage it, but within the community, again, it's hidden, it's probably being perpetrated by family sometimes, yet family is also the provider, so the whole thing, you know, becomes quite complicated. And yeah, that was it.